I've tried to give a lot of careful consideration to what I'd like to bring to us this morning. You would think that being at home, laying in the bed with nothing to do, would give me just plenty of time to read and study and write, but laying flat on your back is pretty hard to write and things like that. So it's kind of hard to hold something up like this for a period of time, which I think maybe some of this then harmonizes a little bit maybe with what I'd like to look at this morning. I don't really have a fancy title because there's several things that kind of are bouncing around that we'd like to talk about. When I was growing up, there was a popular Christian music group that I used to listen to named Guardian, and they wrote a song one time called "Time Stands Still." Time stands still when you need an answer. Time stands still when you feel alone. And I begin to think, there's a popular phrase that we've heard before: time waits for no man. That saying comes from a long line of authors in the past. It can be traced back as far as 1225 to the author of, his name is Saint Maher, M-A-R-H-E-R. Geoffrey Chaucer in 1368, or Thomas Nash in 1596. Charles Dickens in 1844 also used somewhat that same line. Regardless, it's clear that our ancestors understood that the march of time is tireless. There's a Christian writer named John Donne. He lived from 1572 to 1631. And amongst his many writings, he penned something called Meditation 17. And in this meditation, we get two popular phrases that we use ourselves nowadays. One of them is, "No man is an island unto himself." And the second phrase, which is both contained within this meditation, is, "For whom the bell tolls." Now, for those of you that listen to rock music, Metallica wrote a song called "For Whom the Bell Tolls, Time Marches On." Now, I don't particularly consider them theological giants, but everybody sort of has to recognize that there's something going on in the world around us. The meditation that this comes from begins this way. He says, "Perchance he for whom this bell tolls may be so ill as that he knows not it tolls for him." You hear the tolling of the church bell. What does that mean? Who is this bell tolling for? Why are they ringing the bell? Perhaps this person that the bell is ringing for is so ill he doesn't know it's for him. He says, "And perchance I may think myself so much better than I am, as that they who are about me and see my state may have caused it to toll for me." He says, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main." And really that's kind of true. Every person is an irreplaceable part of human history. Every person in this congregation whether you think it or not, you have a purpose. Whether you understand what that purpose is or not is irrelevant to the fact you have a purpose in this life. So he goes on to say, when people are removed from the fabric of humanity, they are removed from my life as well. When people are removed from the fabric of humanity, they're removed from your life. So don't ask for whom the bell tolls. The bell tolls for you and me. That it's a constant reminder that really we all stand in line waiting for our time. You remember in 2 Peter, some asked the question of the apostle, where is the promise of the Lord's coming? This is 2 Peter chapter 3. Verse 4, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. Peter reminds us in verse 8, he says, but beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing. He says that one day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as but one day. The verse teaches us, and we've gone over this before, that our God does not dwell in the past or the future. Our God only dwells in the present. The past, the present, and the future are all one thing laid out before Him. He sees the end from the beginning. He comprehends all time at one time. He is not in a hurry to get anywhere. And He is not delayed that He has not been there yet. And I got to thinking about this in relation to my life and to your life. Is that how many of us are like the great theologians Phineas and Ferb, who said, we're watching and we're waiting on the edge of our seat, anticipating. Now, for those of you that don't know who that is, you've missed something in life. Those of you who do know who that is, you get the concept. But whether you know who they are, whether you've seen that cartoon or not, you understand that basic principle. In life, we are a lot of times watching and waiting, anticipating something. And if we're honest with ourselves and we're honest with just life itself, a bad day is sometimes subjective. And what we mean by that is, in the world there is objective truth and there is subjective perception. So, for example, the objective truth is it's Sunday morning. It is September 17th. It is 11:12 in the morning in Alabama. Now, if you're in Georgia, it's not 11:12, it's 12:12. If you're in California, who knows what time it is over yonder? They've rearranged the whole thing. That's an objective truth. It just is. But a subjective truth is subject to the person that's involved with it. For example, if I said, how was your week? Oh, it was a terrible week. Really? As bad as mine? Really, preacher? Your week was that bad? You had food to eat and you have clothes to wear. You have a house to live in. It's air conditioned in the summertime. It's heated in the wintertime. And you have people who love you and care for you. How bad was your week? Are you homeless, destitute, and poor? Are you a 8-year-old child digging in the dirt in South Africa for 30 cents a day? How bad is your life? Bad day is subjective. But it is an objective fact that all of us, at some point or another, have troubles and trials that we cannot dig ourselves out of. And it is an objective fact that sometimes one day can feel like it lasts 1,000 years. It is a fact that though you may read of Joshua's day in Joshua chapter 10, when the sun stood still long enough for Joshua to defeat the enemies of the Lord, the sun can also stand still when you are, well, you take the disciples, for example, that we spoke of last week, who were going across the river or going across the sea, and they rode and they toiled all night long and got nowhere fast. We've all been there in that point. And we stood on this side of deliverance, and one day felt like 1,000 years. We've also stood on the other side of deliverance. As Moses and the Israelites stood on the other side of the Red Sea. And all the troubles and all the trials and all the problems that we had seemed to be just a single moment in time. That 1,000 years was but a day. And if you don't think that's true, you're not paying attention to your life. Because though I'm now 50 years old, it seems like just yesterday I was graduating high school. It seemed like just yesterday I was getting married. It seemed like just yesterday we were bringing children into this world. It just seems like just yesterday all that occurred. And it's probably why us as older folk will oftentimes say, you know, the other day I did something, and the other day was 15 years ago. It kind of makes your head hurt when people talk about olden times. Kids nowadays talk about the olden times. They talk about listening to old music, and they're talking about stuff from 1995. That's not classic rock, is it? I mean, what's classic music to you? 1970s? 1950s? I'd said something to my father-in-law at one time when he was still alive. There was a young lady that kind of come into our life through a friend of my brother-in-law's. Her name was Rhiannon. I said, oh, like the song. And they all looked at me. What do you mean the song? You know, Fleetwood Mac. Rhiannon. And he looked at me, he said, I haven't heard a song since 1954. Well, that's true. You know, we live our life in certain areas and in certain boxes, and we eventually move out of that box, and it very seldom changes. I don't know what popular music is popular today. Most of it I probably wouldn't care about if I did know about it. So what's the good old days to you? 1995? 1978? 1946? How long ago was that? Just the other day. So the thought then occurred to me, that regardless of where I am in life, regardless of where you are in life, the Bible tells us exactly what we need to know. It doesn't tell us everything we want to know, but it tells us exactly what we need to know. And there's a verse in Psalms 56, I think, that kind of goes along with this. Psalm 56, and before I read this verse, our world is in a bit of a moral mess at this time. Everybody's screaming and crying about the term equality. Well, it's true that it would be appropriate for people to maybe have equal opportunities in life. I don't have a problem with that. I, however, disagree with the idea of equality of outcome. That when we all do something, that we all have to come to the same conclusion at the same time. What would y'all think if all y'all's football games yesterday had equality of outcome? So nobody really thinks about that. They go to the football stadium or the soccer stadium, whatever you want to call it. I guess in soccer they're okay with equality of outcome. They play 95 minutes. At the end of it, we're all tied 0-0. What good was it to play the game? At least you had fun. What fun doing what? Accomplishing nothing. The reality is in life, equality of outcome is an impossibility. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you give 10 people equal opportunity. Those 10 people are not equal in their abilities. And therefore there will not be equality of outcome. But there is one thing that all of us have in common. Is that every single one of us, from the day that we're born, have 24 hours a day to live. Now, you've had a few more 24-hour days than I have. And I've had a few more than some of these little children have had. But the reality is I've had the same 24-hour day that you have had. The question is what have you done with your 24 hours? What have I done with my 24 hours? David says in Psalms 56, verse 1, "Be merciful unto me, O God, for man would swallow me up. He fighting daily oppresseth me." I think a lot of Christians are, they're perplexed about that. They think that if I believe in God, they think that if I follow after God, then my days shouldn't be so hard. Friends, it's a reality that in this wicked world, there are problems. And there are some problems more familiar with God's people than with other people. He says in verse 2, "Mine enemies would daily swallow me up, for they be many that fight against me, O Thou Most High." Have an understanding that there are people who do not like God. And there are people who do not like you because you like God. And people do not abuse their own friends the way that they abuse people they don't like. Now, you say, what do you mean by that? Sometimes women don't understand men. Really? Let me give you an example. Men can be mean, right? Brother Jerry and I can sit down and we can look at each other and we can sit there for 30 minutes and make fun of each other and tell each other, "You ugly, your mama dresses you funny." We can look there at each other and say, "Your mama's so fat, couldn't even lift her up in prayer." Now, that doesn't mean that I'm actually talking about his mama. This is somebody else's mama. This is a mama nobody else has met. She probably doesn't even have any children. It's just a way that men interact with each other. We pick on each other, we annoy each other, but deep down inside we know, really, that if we didn't pick on each other, if I didn't like you, I wouldn't even talk to you. We can leave that conversation and know we're still friends. But then I can have a conversation with somebody in line at Walmart whom I very much disagree with the way that you are behaving right now, or I can have a conversation with somebody in traffic because I disagree with the way that you are behaving right now, and when we get done, we will not be friends. Understand? There are people who do not like God. They may not even like themselves. But they really don't like you because you do like God. And they don't like you because God likes you. But notice verse 3 of this. He says, "What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee." Whatever your 24 hours has been each day that you have lived, has any of that 24 hours been a time that you've been afraid? I bet that all of us have fear in our life. I bet that there's something that every one of us are afraid of in this life. I bet that there are things that have come into your life and you yourself can see no way out of it or around it. What are you supposed to do at that time? The Bible says, "What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee." And I'm going to tell you what, that is a hard thing to do. There was a man in the Old Testament who I think exemplifies this concept probably more than anybody else in the Bible. And that man's name was Abraham. God gave that man a promise in Genesis chapter 12 that God would bless him and that God would give him a seed and that God would make him the father of many nations in Genesis chapter 12. That promise is not brought to fruition for over 25 years. It's very easy for us to read this story in Genesis 12, starting in Genesis 12, going to about Genesis 21. It's very easy for you and me to read this story in just a matter of minutes, right? We can read the history of something that occurred over a period of 25, 50, or 100 years in just a matter of minutes. But unless we stop and realize that the people that this story is about they did not live this story in 15 minutes. They lived every day of the 25 years in the time that it occurred. For 25 years, Abraham waited. Sarah waited. Abraham got older. Sarah got older. Things happened to other people that didn't happen to Abraham. Things happened for others that didn't happen for Abraham. And just like they said to Peter, where is the promise? We're tired of waiting. You ever been there? You ever been to the point where you are tired of waiting? How many times in the Bible are we given a story and also the time frame that goes with it? Jonah was in the whale's belly 3 days, 3 nights. Good. As long as there's nothing happens to me any longer in 3 days or 3 nights, I'm satisfied, right? Well, there was a time when David numbered Israel. And God said, because you've numbered it, I'm going to give you 3 choices of suffering. And I can't remember the exact minute on this because this is just kind of coming to me right now, but one was like several years, one was like several months, and one was like several days. David had enough sense to at least say, let us fall into the hand of God. For in His hand are great mercies. Let us not fall into the hand of men. And the punishment that God meted out to David was the shorter of the 3 choices. You say, well, I would have chosen that. Well, very good. I'm glad you're as good as God. The reality, though, is what David said, let us fall into the hand of God and not into the hand of men. Let what happens to us come from the hand of God. Because regardless of how long it happens, how much it happens, how much is occurred by this, there's always mercy in the hand of God. Very seldom is there mercy in the hand of men. Israel wandered 40 years in the wilderness. Joseph was in prison 15 years. He's taken from his home at a very early age. And Jacob, his father, does not see his teenage son for quite some time. But I kind of have a feeling that if you were to ask Jacob, from the moment that he thinks his son has been devoured by an animal until the time he discovers he's down in Egypt, I kind of have a theory that if you asked him, what's it like, Jacob? He'd say, every day is like 1,000 years. It just won't quit. And yet the moment he sees that Joseph is down in Egypt and he is in charge and he is still alive, I bet he would say that all that time seems but a moment. How many times do you look through the Scriptures and do you see God's people waiting? And how many times do we get the lesson that God's people in the Bible, just like you, get tired of waiting? Irritated by waiting. How long is this going to take? You call this fast food? I've been in this line 6.5 minutes. Right? You know, at least we got food to eat. At least you got the privilege to go somewhere, sit down, and wait for someone to make your food for you. Right? We're talking about first world problems here, aren't we? You know, when Brother Martin Anyani was here several months ago, preaching and traveling around, somebody had asked him while he was over here at Bethlehem, how much do you eat during the day? He says, usually one meal. Just one meal? Don't you take time to sit down? He says, it's not we don't take time, we don't have time. We spend all day gathering food to eat. And we eat one meal a day. We get aggravated if there's no cookies for afternoon snack. We get aggravated if we ain't got time for second breakfast. Right? We don't like to wait. I don't like to wait. But Abraham, as the father of the faithful, was a waiting individual. He had to wait on God. And three times in the book of Genesis. In Genesis 15 and verse 5, in Genesis 17 and verse 16, and in Genesis 18 and verse 10, 3 times God comes back to remind Abraham, I will fulfill my promise to you. I will be faithful. And eventually Abraham, Genesis 16 is where kind of Abraham and Sarah kind of got off the rails on this, and we may speak a little bit more about this in the days ahead, because I think there's a beautiful verse in Genesis 16. It kind of fits all of this. But in Genesis 16, Abraham and Sarah decided, you know what, God's taken too long. And I think God needs our help. And Sarah says, I've got this handmaid Hagar, this Egyptian slave woman that we picked up down here in Egypt. And Abraham, you just go in under her and we'll just take care of this, because God's just taking too long. Tired of waiting on Him. And what happened? What kind of mess did that create? It created a mess that's still boiling in the Middle East right now. That from Hagar come Ishmael and the Ishmaelites. And the whole Middle East is a powder keg over there of the descendants of Ishmael, the son of Hagar, fighting with the descendants of Isaac, the son of Sarah. They're still fighting over there today. It's not political. It's a family fight. And it'll be a family fight until Christ comes back. And it all started. It all started with people who couldn't wait. It all started with people who couldn't find it within themselves to wait on God. But you know what? I can't blame Abraham. You can't blame Abraham. We can't blame Abraham. We're just like him. Every one of us are just like him. In trying to do a little bit of study and research on this, I found a man who'd written a little essay concerning waiting on God. And I want to read you a couple of lines from what he had to say about this. He says, like father, like sons. The children of Abraham have always been and are still a waiting people. The children of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the Israelites, they waited for a lot of things. Waited in the wilderness. They waited for the coming of the Messiah. If we're Christ's people, as Paul says in Galatians, then we're Abraham's seed and children of the promise. So we're waiting for what? The fulfilling of the ultimate promise of the second coming of Christ. They waited for his first coming. We're waiting for his second coming. We're always waiting. Listen to this. He says, we often walk with empty hands, the womb of our hopes still aching for life. Boy, isn't that something? We walk with waiting hands and empty hands, and the womb of our hopes still aching for life. What's it like to want something and not have it? What's it like to be in need and not have that need met? Perhaps as David, you're in some sort of spiritual or relational pit. As David says in Psalms 40, and beginning with the first verse, he says, I waited patiently for the Lord. I don't like that term. I hate that term. He says, I waited patiently. We've all stood in line behind people who are waiting, right? But they're not waiting very patiently. He says, I waited patiently. I remember Elder Sonny Powell saying one time, he says, never ever pray for patience. He said, I prayed for patience one time, and God gave me patience. He gave me an afflicted son that I had to show 700 times how to tie his shoes. If you pray for patience, God will put you in a situation where you have to be patient. And I don't like that. Maybe we should pray that God will help us to be patient. That's the difference. David says in Psalm 40, verse 1, he says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined unto me and heard my cry. He brought me up also out of an horrible pit, out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock and established my goings. So, maybe you're like David. Maybe circumstances have happened to you in life. They're not really your fault. It really wasn't Joseph's fault that he got sold into slavery. It was his brother's envy against him. Now, perhaps his father Jacob aggravated that by showing favor to him, by giving him the coat of many colors and this, that, and the other. Lots of families show favoritism. Some intentional, some unintentional. We have tried to make it a practice in our house to tell our children, you are my favorite oldest child. And they're like, that doesn't mean anything to me. I'm your only oldest child. Well, see, we had you and we stopped with having older children. You are my favorite youngest child. I'm your only youngest child. Yeah, we had you and that we stopped having younger children. You're my, favorite oldest daughter, my favorite youngest daughter, my favorite. You're not my favorite child. You're my favorite of who you are. Now, I know it doesn't make them feel any good. But I hope they understand that there's not any one child we like or love any more than the rest. I hope they understand we love them all. I'm not going to tell. I love you more. We don't love any one child any more than we love the other ones. Now, there's been a few of them I hadn't liked. There's been a few times they've done things I didn't like. But you know what? I'll bet that there's been a few times where I've done things that my own children didn't like either. But I'm sure that there are times and there are situations that you are in that is actually somebody else's fault. And to come out of that, you have to wait patiently on the Lord. Or perhaps you're like Jeremiah. If you had been in Jeremiah's day, and you had been called upon to write like Jeremiah wrote. Jeremiah wrote his book of Lamentations. He's called the weeping prophet. And if you'd seen what Jeremiah saw, you'd be a weeping prophet too. Jeremiah writes in Lamentations chapter 3. He discusses the issue that Israel is in a position of desolation that in this case is not somebody else's fault, it's their fault. You know, this current generation doesn't want to be told they're to be to blame for anything. Right? You're okay and I'm okay. No, we're not. None of us are okay. Nobody wants to take responsibility for who and what they are in today's society. This is kind of what Paul was referring to when he said, in the last days, perilous times shall come, for men shall be lovers of their own selves. That's the very first thing that he says. They're lovers of their own selves. What's most important is how I feel. That's what's got this whole trans equality movement rolling down a hill straight to the belly of hell. Is you need to cater to how I feel about this. Jeremiah's got enough sense to write that Israel is in its condition not because of other people. Israel's in its condition because of Israel. And part of the process of us being able to properly wait on the Lord sometimes is to acknowledge that we are in this problem because of ourselves. And yet, Jeremiah writes in Lamentation chapter 3, verse 25, the Lord is good unto them that wait for Him, to the soul that seeketh Him. It is good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. I'm going to give you one more, because there's another little phrase that I'd like to give to you concerning a lot of this. David said he was in a pit. Could very well be somebody else's fault. Jeremiah said there's a problem, and it's more than likely our fault. But let's notice what Isaiah has to say. In Isaiah chapter 8, and verse 17. Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 17 says, and I will wait upon the Lord that hideth His face from the house of Jacob, and I will look for Him. He says, I'm waiting on a God who's hiding His face from the house of Jacob. Do you ever feel like God hides Himself from you? Are there times when you pray, it seems like you walk right into the throne room of God? And as a little child, you might, I've often thought about this analogy. God is our Father. He is the sovereign of this universe. He is the creator of this universe. He's the one who upholds all things by the word of His power. He is the CEO of this universe. And what would it be like if you were the child of a CEO? Would you not have the privilege to walk right into the president's office and curl up in the lap of the president in his chair and sit there and have a conversation with him? Can you just stop? Just imagine that. This little toddler tootling along, past the secretary, past the vice president, through the big open doors, to the president of the company, my dad. A privilege that nobody else in the company has. Nobody else has the privilege to just walk right into the president's office and curl up in his lap like his children do. And there's some times where it just feels like, yes, I have felt his presence today. Maybe other times where the heavens are black and closed, and we're shut off. Asaph writes in Psalm 77, he writes these words, Psalm 77, and beginning with the 7th verse, "Will the Lord cast off forever? And will he be favorable no more? Is his mercy clean gone forever? And doth his promise fail forevermore? Hath God forgotten to be gracious? And hath he in anger shut up his tender mercies?" Y'all ever feel that way? You ever just sit there and think God has forgotten about me? God doesn't care. Maybe he's got mercies unending for other people, but I think I've run out. I think I've done more than God is willing to forgive. I don't know how to properly describe the holiness of Almighty God. I do not know how to comprehend the pure holiness of God. And I don't think you do either. It's just not humanly possible to comprehend and understand a being who is not tainted with sin, who is as pure as he is, who is as holy as he is, who is as good as he is. And the reason that this kind of causes a little difficulty with us is we're constantly making excuses for ourselves. We're constantly making excuses for other people. Right? We want to be judged, though, based on our intention and not really our actions, while we always judge other people on their actions and very seldom on their intentions. We're always trying to make excuses for people, right? We were talking about this the other day. Back when I was growing up, and back when some of y'all were growing up, in the movies, the bad guys were the bad guys because they were the bad guys. The good guys were the good guys because we need good guys to beat up bad guys. Bad guys wore black hats and good guys wore white hats. That's just the way it was. And the knight slew the dragon because dragons need to be slain. But that's not the situation nowadays. The movies are being rewritten. And the villains are not necessarily the villains. The villains are oppressed people rebelling against the system. And the villains are villains because the good guys stopped being good guys. And they mistreated the other guys and turned the other guys into bad guys. And it's really the good guys' fault. Y'all notice this in movies? Y'all notice this in your little rewriting of your history books? I assure you that when it comes to God and sinners, God is the good guy. God always wears the white hat. We are sinners, and we always wear the black hat. And it doesn't matter who and what we are still sinners. And so I don't know, though, what would possess someone so holy as he is to take note of someone so unholy as I am. He doesn't need me. There's not a thing about me God needs. There's not a thing that I do that attributes or that can contribute to the goodness and greatness of God. God is good. God is great without me. God is holy without me. God reigns on high without me. What would cause him to care about me? What would cause him to send forth his Son? Oh, here's another one. Paul tells us in Galatians that he sent forth his Son in the fullness of time. At his appointed time, he sent forth his Son. For you and for me. Why? Other than the good pleasure of his will, there's no answer. So perhaps you are that person who is in a position, you are in a problem, you are in a deep, dark pit of your own making. Jeremiah writes then in Lamentations 3, where we were earlier, in 3:21, he says, "This I recall to my mind. It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed." What does he say here? Verse 19, "Remembering mine affliction and my misery, the wormwood and the gall, my soul hath them still in remembrance and is humbled in me. This I recall to my mind. Therefore have I hope. It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness." So there's two things that Jeremiah remembers here. He says, "I remember my affliction and I remember my misery." Well, if you're in affliction, it's hard to forget it. And if you're having a hard time, it's hard to forget your misery. My soul has them in remembrance. Oh, wait a minute. I also remember why I'm in this misery. I remember why. I remember what I did that got me here. You're kind of like that man over there in the Gospel of John, chapter 5, the man who was at the hospital with the pool in the middle, where the angel comes down and troubles the water, and whosoever crawls into the water is healed at that time. And Jesus asked the man, "Wilt thou be made whole?" And he says, "Well, I'm trying to get down there, but as I'm crawling down there, somebody runs ahead of me, and they get in there and they get the blessing." And And I'm left here, and Jesus takes that opportunity to heal the man and says to him, "Go and sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." And it's always been my understanding or my interpretation. I could be wrong. It's always been my idea that when Jesus says, "Go and sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you," that if you hadn't have sinned in the first place, you wouldn't be here. If you hadn't have done something dumb with your friends, "Hey, watch this, hold my beer." If you hadn't have done something dumb with somebody else, you wouldn't be in this position. Know anybody like that? You ever been there? And Jesus says, "Go and sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you." But Jeremiah says, "I remember that." He says, "But this I also recall to mind. It's of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed." Listen to this statement. Don't forget this. If you don't remember anything else I say, listen to this statement. When the present seemed a desolate land, they plundered the past for hope. When the present seems a desolate land, they plundered the past for hope. The present seems a hard time for you and me. And I can't see past where I am. Well, what are we to do then? Plunder the past for hope. Go back and read what God did for His people in the Old Testament. Go back and read about the miracles. Go back and read about the splitting of the waters. Go back and read about the manna that came from heaven. Go back and read about the cloud that followed them by day and the pillar of fire that followed them by night. Go back and read about the miraculous birth that God brought forth. This barren woman, that barren woman, this barren woman. There's about 7 different barren women, all leading up to one miraculous birth. Go back and read the promises that God gave to Israel in time past. And the Bible then becomes a journey of joy. This is a thought I had this morning, a journey of joy. Because I'm not in joy right now when I'm reading in the Bible. I'm mad, and I'm upset, and I'm distraught. And this doesn't make any sense, and I can't understand this. Why can't we go on? I'm not very happy. Well, God doesn't want you to be happy to start with. He wants you to be holy. But we all would like to be a little joyful in life, right? So then we look in the Bible and we start reading. And we remind ourselves of this good thing and that good thing and this good thing and that good thing. And the reading of the Bible becomes a journey to joy. And we remind ourselves that whatever time I'm afraid, I'll trust in the Lord. That there's reason for us to trust God. Despite the circumstances, despite the situation, despite people around us and sin within us. If God be for us, who or what effectively can be against us? Let's stand and sing a closing hymn at this time.